Graham, right here on the fastest growing radio station on the planet. Is it any wonder? It is Talk Radio.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio.
Now, let us, without further ado, say a very happy Easter Monday to Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Well, so far so good.
Good.
But not particularly optimistic.
Were you able to celebrate any sort of Easter religious fest without interference from Her Majesty's police?
Well, there is interference in everything you do. I don't want to go to technicalities of this, but actually to attend any church, particularly a service of Holy Communion, which is supposed to be obligatory at Easter, under current regulations, means that it's completely abnormal, that you can't do it properly. So I tend to hang back a bit. I try to go to church every week as a matter of course anyway, but there are a lot of things that are not as far as I'm concerned, fully free.
Yes.
I do get the strong sense that the churches are worshipping government rather than God, and it puts me off.
Yeah,
so,
well,
no,
I think.
For me.
Well, you and I both. I mean, I'm still put off from the idea of travelling. I mean, my main concern is to go and see my mother in America, and for her, I will make all sorts of sacrifices, which may include wearing a mask on a plane. But I'm really not in the business of wanting to go on holiday where you have to put a mask on in the airport, then continue to wear it for hours on end on a plane, and then continue to wear it until you get out of the airport the other end. It's just not for me, really.
So where would be the pleasure in that? I'm not particularly wild about holidays anyway. I mean, I've done a lot of travelling in my life, and it's a different thing. But I think a lot of us, particularly for the purpose of family reunion, because many of us have been separated from close family for very long periods, would do all kinds of things which we find repulsive one way or another. Though there is always that group of people who are totally Simon Pure, who will then come onto the social media to harangue us as traitors and hypocrites and all kinds of things for being human. I did with fanatical dogma when I was a Trotskyist. I don't appreciate it anymore, but there's still some of it about. It's actually, looking back over the past 12 months and more, I think one of the most grievous bits of damage done to the case against shutting down the country and strangling the economy was done by the people I call the lizardists, the ultra fanatics who got it all mixed up with 5G and Bill Gates and all the rest of it, who did immense harm to a very good cause and contributed, in my view, to its defeat. The fact that the opinion polls show constant high support for the most ludicrous measures ever taken by any government has a lot to do with the fact that so many people identified the cause of liberty with nutcases, and still they persist. I'm sick of them. I wish they'd go away. If there is any hope of recovering from this, the presence of these people on what I regard as my side is nothing but a nuisance.
And clearly it's very difficult to persuade people who equate having a driving licence with having some kind of COVID passport to go to football as the same thing. It's very difficult to convince these people that actually that's not in any way the same thing.
Of course, what has happened is that we have become a country where we live by permission of the government.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened, and it won't just be this. Of course, in many cases there'll be no specific regulation saying that you have to do such and such a thing. But there are so many frightened people in the retail trade and in the hospitality trade and on public transport and everywhere else, that even if there's no actual regulation enforcing these things, it will be increasingly difficult to go into shops, to go into pubs and restaurants, to travel on public transport without submitting to all kinds of checks, even if there's no law that specifically says so. And there will be employers who will demand all kinds of things from their employees, which are actually beyond the law, but which they will be able to do because of this atmosphere. Until we actually manage to break the fear and get people to take a rational look at this, that is what is going to happen, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I had a very interesting guest on this morning. I don't know if you were able to listen to Angela Raffle, who's a bit of an expert in. You might want to look at her Twitter. She's a very interesting woman, studies testing on a mass scale, says basically to me this morning that the entire government programme of testing since last year has been basically worse than useless. So not only have they tested in the wrong way, not only have many of the test results been wrong, but also the policy then made on those test results is more or less ridiculous. And so she's now saying if they're going to embark once again on a testing of the population, which is going to be twice a week for everyone, it's doomed to failure because it doesn't give you any information or useful data that you can use.
Well, it's never made all that much sense to me. I think if you could devise a means by which every person in the population could regularly be tested accurately for the presence of disease all the time, then perhaps there might be some use to it. But there is no such possibility. There aren't enough people to do the testing. People can't be expected to test themselves accurately. The equipment necessary and the facilities for reading the test will never exist. So all that was ever going to happen with mass testing was that we were going to give ourselves a false impression of the prevalence of the disease. One of the crucial triumphs of the propaganda of the lockdown fanatics has been the way in which they've persuaded so much of the media and so many people in the public to refer to positive tests as cases.
Yeah.
They're not cases, and this fundamental difference is so crucial to an understanding of what's going on. And there is also a simple rule: seek and ye shall find. When the government set out to start sending test teams into various cities, one thinks particularly of the instance in Leicester some months ago, of course they were going to find some instances if you test for it. But does that mean that Leicester is a hotbed of COVID, or does it mean that Leicester is a hotbed of testing? In my view, it means Leicester is a hotbed of testing. And, and until we have, which we can never have, 100% coverage of regular, accurate testing, that's what all this is going to be, a completely partial view of what's going on, revealing almost nothing, because I have never seen, and maybe you have, or maybe somebody else who could call into your program have, any figures on how many of those who tested positive have gone on to develop symptoms of COVID.
Yes, well, I was constantly asking towards the end of last year for figures from the NHS for people who had been admitted to hospital with COVID and who had then been released at a later date. And that's very difficult to find as well. But by far and away, the majority of people who went into hospital with COVID came out alive. They did not die and they did not suffer from long COVID. They might not have had a very pleasant time, but they all came out.
Well, we have been the victims of a statistical blizzard, which has concealed from us the meaning of a lot of the figures which have been thrown at us. And I still hope, increasingly against hope, that there might one day be a proper, impartial, thorough inquiry into this, which will demonstrate what actually happened. The way in which statistics can be made to show, or not to show, but to suggest things which are either not true or exaggerated, is well known to anybody who studies the subject. And some years ago, I was in a controversy about statistics over police recorded crime figures, in which many people derided me for saying that they were, how shall I put it, unreliable. But eventually this position was vindicated by the facts. And I'm saying it again, it looks to me very much as if we've been subjected to unreliable interpretation of figures, and this still goes on, and it's used all the time to maintain the continued clamp by the state on what was formerly our freedom. And until people are prepared to confront this, and until, particularly, as I say, people in the political and chattering classes who have not done their jobs in the past year, have completely failed in their civic responsibility to their country and to their fellow citizens, until they start doing this, we will continue to live in this awful situation where we live by permission of Mr. Alexander Pfeffel Johnson.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I thought of you a couple of times this weekend. Once when the boat race was on, where they've not only, I mean, it's a pretty good summation of the state of things, where there are two reasons why you can't have the boat race on the Thames. One, Hammersmith Bridge is apparently about to collapse into it, and so it's not safe to go underneath it. Secondly, you can't have people standing on the side, and what they wanted to do was have it on the River Ouse so that they could block off any access for people to actually stand and watch in the open air some people rowing. Then the rowers come out wearing masks, and then they're also, the female rowers are all wearing yellow and white ribbons to signify their support of some kind of sexual abuse policy that's been adopted at Oxford University. Then this morning I was walking past King's College in London, where there's a new mural has appeared, which is like something out of North Korea, and the dear leader, and it talks about how great the NHS is, and it ends with the question, who do you want to thank? And I'm just thinking, this is not the London that I grew up in.
No, it isn't, is it? And why don't they hold the boat race in the middle of the Atlantic?
Or the Suez Canal, perhaps.
Because the Suez Canal, there's plenty of room there. But yeah, or the Great Bitter Lake. Perhaps would be the ideal spot. It is the nonsense goes on and on. But yes, the level of propaganda and state worship which is creeping in. And of course, yet again, this morning on BBC Radio 4's so-called flagship Today programme, who should appear but Professor Ferguson?
Oh, good.
The man whose predictions have plunged us into all this, the absolute king of the stochastic. And there he is again. There was a point when it looked as if people might actually begin to be a bit sceptical about him, but he has actually now become a respected figure. And we live in a country where Professor Neil Ferguson is a respected figure. And I have to say, I find this rather worrying.
Well, I'm afraid he's only respected in certain quarters, though, but these seem to be the people that are running everything.
Well, they're big quarters. That's the problem. You and I and numbers of others maintain a small lighted circle of intelligence, rationality, and skepticism. But look at the opinion polls. Look at the behaviour of people as you walk in. The people who there you are out on the high hills in the brisk spring sunshine and a lovely breeze, and you go past somebody on your bicycle and they're wearing a mask and shying away from you in case you give them the plague. It's still fundamentally, it's still succeeding in terrifying people into destroying their own liberty. And how do we stop it? I have no idea at all.
It really is quite disturbing, isn't it? Let's talk about something else you wrote about this weekend, which I thought was interesting. The policy on pornography. You sort of harkened back to the days of Mary Whitehouse and how she was derided as a sort of a kooky figure, as many people were who were, in those days trying to make sure that censorship existed in the sort of sexual freedom industry, if you like. Tell us about that.
Well, it's not just now. Mary Whitehouse is still hated by quite large numbers of people among the liberal elite. There was a fairly recent episode of, I think, Endeavour, the successor to Inspector Morse, in which an obvious Mary Whitehouse figure was caricatured quite cruelly and made to look both stupid and nasty and wrong. In fact, a lot of what she said, if you examine it now, had a lot of reason to it, and a lot of the things she predicted would happen have happened, and we have become a society in which pornography has moved out from a few grubby backstreet shops and seedy clubs, which you had to, in those days, make an effort to go to if you wanted that sort of thing, into complete generosity. So it takes absolutely no effort at all for anyone to go onto the internet and find all kinds of stuff, which in my childhood would have been regarded as illegal, obscene filth. And the beginning of this was the extraordinary case of the book Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was subject of a trial supposedly about obscenity. Can I ask you a question about this trial? Do you know how many prosecution witnesses there were at the trial on the obscenity of Lady Chatterley's Lover?
I don't know.
There weren't any.
Right.
There were no prosecution witnesses at all.
Right.
Everybody knows two things about it. One, that the book was permitted, and secondly, that the prosecution lawyers asked whether people would be happy to let their wives or servants read it. Nobody knows anything about the case at all. I have actually read Lady Chatterley's Lover. And
it's quite dull, isn't it?
Essay about, well, it's worse than dull. It's embarrassingly bad, including all the stuff about red trousers and lesbians and anti-Semitism. Right. If anyone tried to publish it now, they wouldn't get it past first base. It's the ravings actually of a man on the edge of his reason. It's complete drivel, but it was portrayed as fantastic literature to try and because it was being used as a battering ram to break down what were actually perfectly sensible obscenity laws. The interesting thing about the trial is all the defence witnesses of the great and the good who were asked to give their opinion on it, they had all read it in unexpurgated versions. It was perfectly possible for the liberal elite to nip across to Paris and buy copies and bring them back, and they did. King George V was supposed to have confiscated it from Queen Mary at some point in the 1930s. It wasn't unknown. Well, the difference that was made by the trial was that pornography then became available to everybody, and it came first of all into the shops, into magazines, and then it came even more disastrously onto the internet, where it is now flourishing and poisoning huge numbers of minds. What we were told at the time was this would be a great cleansing. Everybody would become sexually healthy. The whole business of hiding this stuff away in backstreet bookshops would come to an end, and we'd all be liberated and all be like the Swedes. It hasn't turned out that way at all. Now we have, quite rightly, people greatly dismayed about the sort of thoughts in the minds of young men in schools, and the sort of things that they say and say they want to do, and sometimes do to young women, are absolutely revolting and beyond belief. But where did this come from? It came from the explosion of pornography into our society, which was engineered by people who despised Mary Whitehouse and her warnings, and who all, it seems to me, have turned out to be completely wrong. Which of us really, particularly parents who know the sort of stuff that's coming out on the internet, which their children may read, which of us really actually thinks that it wasn't a mistake to liberate pornography now?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, because it's clearly another case of the kind of the so-called liberal elite not really quite understanding the criminal fraternity. Because what most pornography now is a criminal business, and it's run by people who are rather unsavoury and who really don't care what your children are seeing as long as they're making money out of it.
Well, exactly. It's turning the human flesh into a commodity. It's not all that many steps above slavery in its wickedness. And in many cases, I think it probably involves slavery.
I think so. I think there's no doubt about that, because there's also now apparently no way to stop it, because anybody who talks about the original formation of the internet, which was meant to be free, a place where there was no limits, no constrictions on anything at all, because it would somehow police itself. Well, it clearly doesn't police itself, because every time you try and stop something in one country, they just move to another.
That seems to be so, though I suppose if we had, which I would not want to have, a government like China's, some way it might be found. But I don't think China has any particular interest in suppressing pornography. It's free speech they want to suppress.
Yeah, exactly right. And in fact, even in China, I'm told by people who go there, you can access parts of the internet they don't want you to anyway, because there's ways around it.
It is true. It gets increasingly difficult, and the Chinese state gets better and better at suppressing it. But there are ways around it, but that doesn't mean there always will be. Initially, it was claimed when all this began that it would be impossible to censor the internet at all. I think the government in Peking has proved definitively that was a wrong prediction.
Indeed. One final question for you, Peter, because we're nearly out of time. The other thought I had was, you've lived in Russia, or the Soviet Union, I guess, before it was dismantled. I mean, I know this might sound slightly glib, but I mean, how much of what you had there and you experienced there are you seeing here, albeit in a slightly watered down way?
Well, when I was there, it was time of liberation. It was the end of the old regime, and we were moving. Russia was moving from being a totalitarian, communist, dogmatic state to being possibly a free country. I mean, what happened after it was, for many reasons, a tragedy and a lost opportunity. So it was going in the opposite direction. And I'd spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe before. I see a lot of things, and have for some time seen a lot of things which are reminiscent of life in those countries, of a dominant ideology, of any one idea being acceptable, of people being expected to be increasingly loyal to the state. And as we saw on Good Friday in the Polish church in Balam, a scorn for religion, which I have to say that I regard as one of the bulwarks against tyranny, because it sets people under a different authority. The reason why totalitarian states hate Christianity is because it's a rival to them. And it puts people under a wholly different authority, in which they may well ignore the instructions of the totalitarian state. So I think that event on Friday, where police officers came into a church and prevented a church service, did send rather more shivers down my spine than quite a lot of other things I've seen in recent months.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Peter, delightful as ever to talk to you. We'll see you next week. Enjoy the rest of Easter weekend. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist there. Read his column online. You can find it, of course, on his own Twitter page. We'll retweet it over the course of the day here as well at Talk Radio. Lots more for us to do, including more of your calls. 0344 499 1000 is the number. This is Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
More than 3,500 pubs and venues could go out of business.
Talk Radio.
Whether you're dreaming of the